He arrived that morning, the silver car cutting through the mud like a promise. We knew then that nothing would ever be the same.
They told her the farmhouse had been empty for years. A quiet place where the past couldn't follow. They had walked this orchard countless times, but the sight of the old shed always brought a quiet dread.
They stood before the shed, a relic of a time long past. What secrets lay behind that weathered door, neither of them could yet know. Her fingers, slightly reddened by the cold air, finally closed around the rough, weathered iron.
Funny thing about losing everything, it never happens all at once. It arrives in ordinary moments, wearing ordinary faces, carrying ordinary pieces of paper that somehow hold the power to dismantle an entire life. For Caroline Merritt, the unraveling began on a Tuesday morning in late October when she stood on the front porch of the house she had called home for 16 years, watching a stranger change the locks on her own front door. The locksmith didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the brass deadbolt, turning his Phillips head screwdriver with the efficiency of a man who had done this particular job more times than he cared to remember. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that the scratch on the doorframe near the bottom hinge had come from a tricycle on Christmas morning, 2018. He didn't know that the welcome mat beneath his boots had been a gift from her husband, Daniel, who had found it at a flea market in Burlington during their 5th anniversary trip because the hand-painted letters reminded him of her handwriting. The locksmith knew none of these things. He only knew the work order. 3 weeks earlier, Caroline had stood beside a freshly dug grave in a cemetery overlooking the Connecticut River, wondering how she would learn to breathe in a world that no longer contained Daniel Merritt. The minister had spoken about grace. Neighbors had brought casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil. Someone placed a single white rose on top of the casket before the first shovel of earth fell. Caroline couldn't remember who. She couldn't remember much of anything from that afternoon except the weight of her 9-year-old son's hand gripping hers so tightly that her fingers went numb. Now, standing on the porch she had swept 10,000 times, she understood that grief was not the worst thing waiting for her on the other side of loss. Dorothea Merritt arrived 20 minutes after the locksmith finished. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Carolyn's mother-in-law carried authority the way certain women carry heirloom jewelry, not with display, but with the quiet certainty that it belonged to her by right. The legal documents she placed on the porch railing were brief. The house belonged to the Merritt family trust. Daniel's death had triggered a reversion clause. Caroline had 72 hours to vacate. No negotiation, no appeal. Just paper, ink, a notary's stamp. Caroline looked at the woman who had sat beside her at Daniel's funeral, who had held Eli's other hand during the prayer, who had whispered the words "we're still family" before the reception ended. She searched Dorothea's face for some trace of hesitation, some flicker of the grandmother who had once knelt on the living room carpet building block towers with a giggling toddler. She found nothing. Dorothea's voice was measured, almost clinical. "I've spoken with the estate attorney. You'll receive Daniel's personal effects within 30 days. Caroline's throat tightened, but no words came. What could she say to a woman who had already decided? What argument could pierce armor forged from old money, older grudges, a lifetime spent believing that family meant bloodline rather than love? She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She folded Eli's favorite blanket, the blue one with the fraying edge that he rubbed between his fingers when he couldn't sleep, placed it inside a suitcase, packed a second bag with whatever clothes she could reach, collected a small cardboard box of family photographs, carried everything to the aging silver SUV parked in the driveway. 2 suitcases. 1 box. 16 years reduced to what could fit in a cargo hold. Eli climbed into the back seat without being told. He buckled his seatbelt, pressed his forehead against the window, watched the house grow smaller as they reversed down the driveway. His voice was so quiet Caroline almost missed it. "Mom, will Dad know where to find us?" She adjusted the rearview mirror, smiled. Not because she felt like smiling, but because she could not bear to let him see anything else. "I think he always will." The weeks that followed blurred together like rain on a windshield. Caroline drove. She parked. She counted the cash left in her wallet each morning, subtracted the cost of gas, divided what remained by the number of days until she could figure out what came next. The math never worked. It wasn't supposed to. Desperation doesn't follow arithmetic. They slept in the SUV, rest stops on the interstate, parking lots behind grocery stores that stayed lit through the night. Once behind a church in a town whose name Caroline forgot before they left it. Every morning before sunrise, she wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield with the sleeve of her jacket, helped Eli button his school shirt, always the white one. The only one without wrinkles, combed his hair with her fingers, drove him to whichever elementary school was closest, signed him in as a visiting student, picked him up at 3:15. Every evening she told him they were on an adventure. Children have a beautiful way of believing the people who love them. Caroline prayed he would believe her a little longer. She applied for jobs online using the public library's computer, waited tables for 2 shifts at a diner near the New Hampshire border before the manager told her she couldn't bring her son into the kitchen anymore. She called shelters. Most were full. The ones with openings required documentation she hadn't thought to grab during those 72 hours. She called Dorothea once, not to plead, but to ask if Eli could stay with his grandmother while Caroline found stable housing. Dorothea's answer was a silence that lasted 4 seconds, then a click, then nothing. Caroline set the phone on the passenger seat, looked at Eli sleeping in the back, his cheek pressed against the blue blanket, his breath fogging the cold window in small, rhythmic circles. She made herself a promise she had no idea how to keep. She would find them a home before the first snow. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A lawyer she had never met, a man named Grady Farnsworth, whose voice carried the unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to delivering news that changed people's lives, informed her that her maternal grandmother, Harriet Oakes, had passed away 11 days earlier. Caroline hadn't known. No one had told her. She barely remembered Harriet. A few childhood visits, the smell of cinnamon, a farmhouse, apple tree, distant memories wrapped in the kind of golden light that might have been real or might have been wishful thinking. Harriet had left her 11 acres of land in rural Vermont, an old farmhouse, an abandoned apple orchard, a weather-beaten wooden shed standing at the edge of the property. Caroline didn't hear opportunity. She heard survival. If she sold the land quickly, she could pay off the credit card debt that had been compounding since Daniel's hospital bills. She could put down a deposit on a small apartment. She could buy Eli a bed frame, a desk, a lamp that didn't run on batteries. She could stop pretending the back seat of an SUV was an adventure. Grady Farnsworth mailed the deed to a post office box Caroline had rented for $9 a month. Along with the deed came a second envelope, smaller, lighter, addressed in handwriting so elegant it looked like calligraphy. She opened it in the parking lot while Eli ate a peanut butter sandwich in the passenger seat. Inside was a single sentence, written on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of dried lavender. "Before you sell this land, open the old shed." Caroline read it twice, folded the note carefully, slipped it into the pocket of her jacket, where it settled beside a gas station receipt, 3/4, a stick of lip balm, the small debris of a life lived from the front seat. At that moment, she believed her grandmother had left her a piece of property, a transaction waiting to happen, nothing more. She had no idea she was about to inherit something far more valuable than anything money could buy. They arrived at the Oaks farm on a Friday afternoon in early November. The drive from the New Hampshire border took just under 3 hours. The last 40 minutes wound through roads that narrowed with every mile, pavement giving way to gravel, gravel giving way to hard-packed dirt lined with birch trees whose white bark peeled like old wallpaper. Eli pressed his face against the window, watching the landscape change. Strip malls became general stores, traffic lights became stop signs became nothing at all. The farmhouse appeared around a bend, sitting on a gentle rise overlooking a valley that stretched westward toward the Green Mountains. It was smaller than Caroline expected. White clapboard sign, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, green shutters, one missing, 2 hanging crooked, a stone chimney darkened by decades of wood smoke. The roof sagged slightly above the kitchen, as though the house had grown tired of holding itself upright. Eli stepped out of the SUV before Caroline turned off the engine. He stood in the driveway, if it could be called a driveway. It was really just 2 tire ruts worn into the grass, tilting his head back, staring at the sky. His voice carried wonder she hadn't heard in weeks. "Mom, it's so quiet." He was right. The silence here was different from anything Caroline had experienced during those weeks of parking lots, highway rest stops, fluorescent-lit libraries. This wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of stillness, the kind that settles over old places where time has decided to move more slowly, where the earth remembers footsteps from generations ago. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, a breeze stirred the branches of the orchard. A few late-season leaves detached themselves from their branches, drifting downward in slow spirals. The air smelled of cold earth, damp wood, something sweet, apples. Fallen apples, soft with fermentation, scattered beneath trees that had continued bearing fruit long after anyone stopped picking them. Grady Farnsworth met them at the front door. He was older than his voice had suggested, mid-60s, silver, wire-rimmed glass, the sort of man who wore a necktie even when no one expected him to. He handed Caroline a ring of keys, 3 keys total, each one different, each one heavy with the particular weight of doors that hadn't been opened in a long time. He also handed her the second envelope. Caroline recognized the handwriting immediately. The same elegant script, the same cream-colored stationery. She opened it standing on the porch, one hand resting on the railing her grandmother's hands must have gripped 10,000 times. "Before you sell this land, open the old shed." The same sentence, the same instruction. Harriet had written it twice, once for the mailed package, once to be delivered in person, as though she knew her granddaughter might need the reminder at the exact moment she was standing on the exact porch where the instruction would matter most. Grady excused himself with a handshake, a business card, the promise that he would begin the listing process whenever Caroline was ready. His taillights disappeared around the bend. The gravel settled. The stillness returned. Eli was already walking toward the orchard. Caroline followed. The grass reached nearly to Eli's knees. Wildflowers had overtaken the places where neat garden paths once ran. She could see their ghosts beneath the growth, the faint outlines of stone borders, the remains of a wooden gate that had rotted at its base. Apple trees stretched in long rows across the slope, their branches bent beneath the weight of unpicked fruit. Some limbs had split under the burden. Others reached outward like arms waiting to be held. Eli stopped walking, pointed past the last row of trees. There it was. A small wooden building standing alone beneath a row of towering sugar maples. Its red paint had faded to the color of rust, peeling away in long strips that curled like parchment. One shutter hung at an angle. The roof dipped in the center. Moss crept along the northern wall. The whole structure leaned slightly eastward, as though it had spent 50 years listening for something coming from that direction. Yet somehow Caroline noticed this with a strange tightness in her chest. The shed didn't look abandoned. It looked patient, as though it had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting for exactly this moment. Eli glanced up at her. "Is that the one Grandma wrote about?" Caroline nodded slowly. "Maybe we'll look inside before we leave tomorrow." She still planned to sell the farm. Nothing had changed. At least that's what she kept telling herself. The next morning arrived wrapped in the kind of light that only November in Vermont can produce, pale gold filtered through bare branches, casting shadows so long they seemed to reach across the entire valley. Caroline woke before Eli. The farmhouse bedroom was cold. The heating system hadn't been serviced in years. She pulled on her jacket, carried a cup of instant coffee made with water heated on the gas stove, stepped onto the back porch. The shed was still there, of course it was. Buildings don't disappear overnight. But something about seeing it in the morning light, quieter, softer, the red paint almost translucent beneath the frost, made it feel closer than it had the evening before, as though it had moved a few steps toward the house during the night. Eli appeared beside her, still wearing his pajamas, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the shed, then at his mother, then back at the shed. Caroline took a slow sip of coffee, set the mug on the porch railing, reached for her jacket pocket where the folded note had remained since the day she first received it. She said quietly, more to herself than to Eli, more to Harriet than to either of them. They crossed the orchard together. The grass was stiff with frost, crackling softly beneath their boots. The fallen apples had darkened overnight, their skins tightening in the cold. The air smelled sharper than yesterday, wood smoke from a distant chimney, pine resin, the faint mineral scent of frozen ground. When they reached the shed, Caroline noticed something she hadn't expected. The door wasn't locked, no padlock, no deadbolt, only a simple iron latch blackened by age, smoothed by years of fingers pressing it open, securing the door in its frame. She touched it. The metal was cold in a way that felt deliberate, as though the latch itself was asking whether she was certain. Eli's voice came softly from behind her. "Grandma wanted us to come here first." Caroline lifted the latch. The old wooden door groaned as it swung inward, a low, resonant sound, more like a cello note than a creak. Dust stirred. Motes drifted through shafts of morning light that entered through a window on the eastern wall, a window so clean it seemed impossible that no one had cared for this building in years. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Cedar dry paper. Something deeper, older, the concentrated essence of time itself, compressed into the grain of wooden walls, absorbed into the fibers of cloth, settled into the cracks between floorboards. Not the smell of neglect, the smell of preservation. Caroline had expected to find rust, broken furniture, mice droppings, cardboard boxes disintegrating under their own weight. Instead, she found a room that looked as though someone had stepped out of it that very morning. Shelves lined 3 walls, each one level, each one holding objects arranged with visible intention. Old gardening tools hung from iron hooks, pruning shears, a wooden-handled rake, each one cleaned, oiled, positioned exactly where someone had decided it belonged. A wooden rocking chair sat near the eastern window, its seat polished by decades of use, a folded quilt resting across its back in a pattern of blue cream, pale green. The quilt wasn't dusty, it was simply waiting. Nothing in this room looked abandoned, everything looked expected. Eli wandered toward a workbench pushed against the far wall. His fingers hovered above the objects resting on its surface without touching them. The way children sometimes approach things they instinctively understand are sacred. "Mom, you should see this." Caroline stepped closer. On the workbench, arranged in a careful row, sat a small brass lantern, its glass panels intact. Its wick trimmed a pair of reading glasses with tortoiseshell frames, a silver pocket watch with a chain so fine it looked like spider silk, a leather-bound notebook whose cover had darkened to the color of strong tea. Beside these objects rested a single envelope, cream-colored, familiar stationery. Across the front in handwriting, Caroline now recognized the way a child recognizes a parent's voice in a crowded room, were 3 words: "For my family." Caroline's pulse quickened. She picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing, a single sheet of paper, folded once. She opened it with the care of someone handling a document that might dissolve at the touch. Harriet's handwriting filled the page in neat, even lines. "If you're reading this, then you've honored my only request. Thank you. The things inside this shed are not valuable because of what they're worth. They're valuable because they tell the truth. Please don't rush. Some stories need to be discovered one page at a time." Caroline lowered the letter. She read it again, then a third time, not because the words were complicated, but because each reading seemed to reveal a different layer of meaning, the way sunlight passing through old glass shifts the color of everything it touches. Harriet hadn't explained what was in the shed. She hadn't left instructions. She hadn't said sell this or donate that or call this person. She'd only said, "Don't rush." Caroline suddenly understood why. This room wasn't meant to be inventoried. It wasn't meant to be appraised, packed into boxes, divided among air. It was meant to be experienced, the way a conversation is experienced, the way a meal shared with someone you love is experienced, one moment at a time. Eli's voice broke through her thoughts, arriving from the far corner of the shed, where the light didn't quite reach. "Mom, what's that?" Caroline turned. Half hidden beneath a white linen cloth, pressed against the back wall as though someone had deliberately positioned it away from the window's direct light, stood a large cedar chest. Brass corners that had darkened with age, a curved lid, iron hinges. The wood itself was beautiful, warm, reddish-brown, tight grain, the kind of cedar that fills entire rooms with its scent for decades. Unlike everything else in the room, the chest was locked. On top of the lid, resting in its exact center as though placed there by someone who understood the importance of ceremony, sat an old iron key. It was heavy, 3 inches long. Its shaft was simple, no ornate handle, no decorative flourish, just function, just purpose. Caroline picked it up. The metal was warm, not warm the way metal becomes warm in a heated room. The shed was barely warmer than the air outside, warm the way a hand feels warm after holding something precious. As though the key had been waiting, gathering whatever patient energy old iron gathers in the dark, saving it for the exact moment someone would finally reach for it. Caroline didn't unlock the chest right away. She stood beside it, holding the key in her closed fist, listening to the wind outside. Branches scraped gently across the roof. A bird called from somewhere deep in the orchard, a single note repeated twice, then silence. It felt almost disrespectful to rush. These objects, the lantern, the glasses, the watch, the notebook, the chest itself, had been arranged by someone who had taken extraordinary care. Every placement was deliberate. Every surface was clean. Whoever had filled this room had done so not with haste but with reverence, the way people prepare a table for guests who haven't arrived yet but who are deeply, profoundly welcome. Those people deserved a few moments of silence before their story was opened. Caroline took a slow breath, slid the iron key into the lock. The mechanism resisted for half a second. Rust, age, the natural reluctance of things that had been sealed for a long time, then yielded with a soft click that echoed through the shed like a held breath finally released. The lid creaked open. Inside, arranged with the same careful attention that governed every other object in the room, lay dozens of bundles. Letters tied with cotton string. Leather-bound journals, 3 of them stacked spine to spine. Yellowed photographs pressed between sheets of wax paper. Dried flowers tucked into the folds of a linen handkerchief. A small velvet pouch containing something Caroline couldn't identify by touch alone. On top of everything, resting as though it had been placed there last or placed there first, depending on how you understood the intention, was a black and white photograph. Caroline lifted it from the chest with both hands. The edges had yellowed. One corner was slightly bent, but the image was remarkably clear, as though the photographer had understood that this particular moment would need to survive longer than most. 3 people stood together beneath apple trees, the same apple trees visible through the shed's eastern window. The same orchard, the same farm. A different decade, a different season. The trees were heavy with fruit. The grass was tall. The light had the particular warmth of late summer, but unmistakably the same place. Caroline recognized 2 of them immediately. On the left stood her grandmother, Harriet, young, perhaps 30, perhaps younger, smiling with a radiance Caroline had never seen in the few photographs she remembered from childhood. This wasn't the polite smile of someone posing for a camera. This was joy, unguarded, unperformed, the kind of happiness that arrives before self-consciousness can edit it. Beside her stood Gerald Oakes, Caroline's grandfather. His arm rested across Harriet's shoulders with the comfortable weight of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He wore work clothes, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, boots caked with orchard soil. He wasn't smiling so much as radiating contentment, the quiet satisfaction of a man standing exactly where he wanted to be. Between them, not behind them, not to the side, but between them, positioned with the same ease as the couple flanking him, stood a third person. A man Caroline had never seen before. He was young, mid-30s, perhaps a year or 2 older, dark hair, strong jaw. His sleeves were rolled up the same way Gerald's were, his boots carrying the same orchard dirt. He wasn't posing for the camera. He was laughing, head tilted slightly back, mouth open, eyes crinkled shut, the kind of full-bodied laughter that follows a joke so perfect it catches you before you can prepare your face. Caroline stared at him, studied the angle of his shoulders, the way he stood between Harriet and Gerald without any visible awkwardness, without the stiffness of a guest or the deference of an employee. He stood the way family stands, comfortable, claimed, belonging. Eli looked over her shoulder. "What do you think his name was?" Caroline shook her head slowly. "I don't know." That answer unsettled her more than she expected. Families remember people. They remember the uncle who told bad jokes at Thanksgiving, the cousin who showed up late to every wedding, the neighbor who brought pie every Christmas Eve until the year she didn't, because she couldn't anymore. Families remember, especially the people who appear in cherished photographs, especially the people who stand at the center of the frame with the ease of someone who has earned that position through years of presence. Yet in 42 across every holiday dinner, every phone call, every family gathering, every late-night conversation with her mother about the past, no one had ever mentioned this man. Not once. Not even in passing. Caroline turned the photograph over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, the kind that comes from a fountain pen, not a ballpoint, was a single sentence. "Some families are built by birth. Others are built by courage." She read the words, then read them again. Then a third time, her lips moving silently, as though the sentence contained a melody she was trying to hear. Something about those words refused to leave. They settled into her mind the way certain phrases do, not because they're clever, but because they're true in a way that ordinary language rarely achieves. Built by courage, not by obligation, not by expectation, not by the accidents of blood. By courage. Caroline placed the photograph carefully on the workbench beside the chest. She reached back inside, lifted out the first bundle of letters, untied the cotton string with fingers that trembled slightly from cold. She told herself, only from cold. The earliest letter was dated October 1968. The handwriting belonged to Harriet. The same elegant script, the same cream-colored paper, though this sheet was older, thinner, its edges softened by 56 years of careful handling. "Dear Amos." Caroline stopped. Amos, the stranger in the photograph, the laughing man standing between her grandparents beneath the apple trees, finally had a name. She continued reading. The first few letters were ordinary, beautifully ordinary. Harriet wrote about the autumn harvest, bushels of Cortland apples stacked in the barn, the smell of cider pressing, a new recipe for apple butter that used less sugar than the one her mother had passed down. She wrote about fresh pies cooling on the kitchen windowsill, the first snowfall of the season, which arrived 3 days earlier than Gerald had predicted, a fact Harriet mentioned with unmistakable amusement. Neighbors stopping by with jars of homemade raspberry jam, the church fundraiser, the price of firewood, it all felt warm, safe, familiar. Like opening a forgotten family album whose pages smell of vanilla, whose photographs show people caught in the middle of living, not posing, not performing, just. But gradually, letter by letter, the tone began to shift. "I know people have begun asking questions. Please don't blame yourself. Some hearts simply refuse to understand what kindness looks like." Caroline frowned. She reached for the next letter, then the next. Each one answered something while raising 2 more questions. The warmth remained. Harriet's prose never lost its gentleness, but beneath the surface a current of tension had appeared, the way a river looks calm from a bridge but carries tremendous force underneath. Amos wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a hired farmhand. He wasn't a distant relative passing through Vermont on his way to somewhere more important. He was here almost every day. He worked beside Gerald in the orchard, pruning, grafting, hauling baskets of fruit to the barn. He shared family dinners. He celebrated birthdays. He was present at Christmases, harvest festivals, 4th of July picnics. His name appeared in letter after letter, with the natural frequency of someone who had always been there. The way you mentioned the weather, the way you mentioned the kitchen table, not as something remarkable, but as something permanent. Yet Caroline had never heard the name Amos Hale spoken once in her entire life. Eli's voice reached her from across the room, where he had been carefully examining another stack of photographs he'd found on a lower shelf. "Mom, I think he's in all of these." Caroline walked over. He was right. There was Amos repairing a wooden fence, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a hammer mid-swing. Amos teaching a group of neighborhood children how to carve pumpkins on the farmhouse porch, orange pulp on his hands, a grin on his face. Amos sitting beside Harriet on the porch steps, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, their heads tilted toward each other at the exact same angle, the way people mirror each other when they've spent years in close company. Amos standing in the orchard during a snowfall, his arms spread wide, his face turned upward, catching flakes on his tongue like a child. Then Caroline found the photograph that made her stop breathing. Amos holding a newborn baby. The image was slightly blurred, the photographer's hand must have been unsteady, but the expression on his face was unmistakable. He held the infant with extraordinary tenderness, both arms cradling, his chin lowered, his eyes soft with something that went beyond affection, beyond fondness, into the territory of devotion. He held that baby the way family holds a child. Not a guest being polite, not a neighbor paying respects, family. Caroline studied the photograph for a long time. The baby's face was tiny, wrinkled, new. The blanket was white with a blue edge. She knew that blanket. She had seen it in her mother's things. She had seen it in photographs of her own first birthday. The baby was her mother. Caroline's pulse quickened. She set the photograph down carefully as though it might shatter. Something wasn't adding up. A man who appeared in every family photograph for decades, who held newborn children with the tenderness of a father, who worked the land, who celebrated holidays, who laughed with her grandparents beneath their apple trees, had been completely, surgically erased from family memory. Not forgotten. Erased. There is a difference. Forgetting is passive. It happens when no one bothers to remember. Erasure is active. It requires effort. It requires every person in a family to agree, silently or otherwise, never to speak a name again. To remove someone from the story so thoroughly that their grandchildren grow up believing they never existed. Who had decided Amos Hale should disappear? Why? Caroline searched deeper inside the chest. Beneath the photographs, beneath the pressed flowers, beneath the velvet pouch which she now opened to find a small brass compass, its needle still trembling faintly north, rested 3 leather-bound journals. The first bore Harriet's name on the cover in gold lettering that had faded to a whisper. The second was Gerald's, his name embossed in a heavier hand, the leather cracked along the spine from frequent opening. The third had no name, no label, no identifying mark of any kind. Only a pressed apple blossom, pale pink, papery, impossibly delicate, tucked beneath a worn leather strap that held the journal closed. Caroline reached for it instinctively. Her fingers had barely touched the leather when a folded envelope slipped from between the journal's pages, drifting to the wooden floor with the slow descent of something that had been waiting decades for permission to fall. The envelope had never been sealed. Its flap was simply folded inward. Across the front, in Harriet's unmistakable handwriting, the same script that had written "Before you sell this land," were 6 words. "Read this only after finding Amos." Caroline's breath caught. She held the envelope without moving, as though the act of opening it too quickly might disturb whatever fragile balance had kept this room intact for 26 years. Finding Amos. The phrase made no logical sense. Amos had lived more than half a century ago. According to the dates in these letters, he had been part of this farm from 1968 onward. He would be in his 80s now, if he was alive at all. Unless Harriet hadn't meant finding the man, perhaps she had meant finding his story, finding the truth that had been locked inside this chest, hidden inside this shed, preserved on this land, waiting for someone who had lived enough life to understand why it mattered. Caroline's hands trembled. She unfolded the letter. It was shorter than she expected, just a few lines, written in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the earlier letters, as though Harriet had been older when she wrote it, her fingers less certain but her intention absolute. "If you've come this far, then you've already met the man our family chose to forget. The world called him many things. We called him family. Before you judge what happened next, promise me you'll hear every voice before deciding the truth." Caroline lowered the page. Outside, the wind stirred the old apple trees. Their bare branches scraped softly across the roof of the shed, not harshly, not like something trying to get in, but gently, like whispered voices, like the murmur of people who have been waiting a very long time to be heard. For the first time since arriving in Vermont, selling the farm no longer seemed important. Not unimportant, the debts were real, the unpaid bills were real. Eli's need for a stable home was real, but no longer urgent in the way it had felt yesterday. Yesterday, this land had been an asset, a number, a transaction that could convert acres into rent checks, empty rooms into security deposits. Now it was something else, something that couldn't be measured in square footage or appraised by a county assessor. Caroline looked back at the nameless journal resting inside the cedar chest. Its leather was the color of dark honey. The apple blossom tucked beneath its strap had been pressed so carefully that individual petals were still distinguishable, each one thinner than tissue paper, each one carrying the faintest blush of pink. Whoever Amos Hale was, whatever he had done, whatever had been done to him, Harriet had protected his story for more than 50 years. She had cleaned this shed, organized these shelves, preserved these letters, these photographs, these journals. She had locked the chest, placed the key on its lid, written the note, instructed the lawyer, arranged every detail with the patience of someone planting a tree she knew she would never sit beneath. Caroline realized something that sent a chill through her, despite the warmth of the iron key still resting in her palm. The real inheritance had never been the land. It had never been the farmhouse, the orchard, the 11 acres of Vermont hillside with their views of the Green Mountains. It had always been the truth. Slowly, with the reverence of someone opening the first page of a book that has waited a lifetime to be read, Caroline reached for Amos Hale's journal. She turned to the first page. The handwriting was different from Harriet's, steadier, more deliberate. Each letter formed with the precision of someone who had been taught that penmanship was a form of respect, respect for the reader, respect for the words, respect for the act of committing thought to paper. The ink was dark blue, faded at the edges of each stroke, but still legible, still carrying the voice of a man Caroline had never met but was beginning to feel she already knew. There was no name on the first page, no date, no address, only one sentence centered on the paper as though the entire journal had been written to support its weight. If you are reading this, then Harriet finally believed the world was ready to know who I really was. Caroline lowered the journal, looked toward the eastern window, where morning light was now streaming fully into the shed, illuminating the dust motes, the wooden shelves, the framed photographs, the rocking chair, the quilt. Outside, Eli had wandered back into the orchard. She could see him through the glass chasing fallen leaves across the frost-stiffened grass, laughing as the wind carried them just beyond his reach, his blue jacket bright against the gray-brown landscape. A lump formed in her throat. She knew that feeling. Not the whole of Amos Hale's story, she hadn't read enough for that, but the feeling embedded in that single sentence. The feeling of being someone the world isn't ready to understand. The feeling of needing another person to decide on your behalf that the time has finally come for people to know who you really are. Only a month earlier, she had been told to leave the home where she had spent 16 years loving a family that had decided she no longer belonged. No one had shouted. No one had cursed her name. They had simply efficiently, legally, without raising a single voice, determined that she was no longer necessary. The pain of being unwanted rarely needed cruel words. Silence could be just as sharp. A locked door could say everything a person chose not to. Caroline closed the journal gently. Not because she didn't want to read more, but because she understood now why Harriet had written "Don't rush." Some stories aren't meant to be consumed. They're meant to be received slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention that honors both the person who lived them and the person who is finally being trusted to hear them. She placed the journal back inside the cedar chest, rested her palm flat against its cover. The leather was cool. The apple blossom trembled faintly as the lid settled. Then she did something she hadn't expected. She picked up the iron key from the workbench, held it tightly in her right hand, walked to the doorway of the shed, leaned against the frame, watched her son playing in the orchard. The morning light had shifted. The frost was melting. The apple trees cast long shadows across the grass, their bare branches reaching eastward like arms extended in welcome. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a woodpecker drummed against a dead elm, a steady, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of a landscape that had continued living long after the people who loved it had gone. Caroline looked back at the shed behind her, the neat shelves, the rocking chair, the cedar chest, the photographs, the letters, the journals. When she had first seen this building yesterday afternoon, she had seen an old storage shed on a piece of land she intended to sell. A structure, a liability, something to be mentioned in the listing description, photographed for the real estate website, appraised at whatever value the county assigned to weather-beaten wood. Now she saw something else entirely. Not a storage room, not a forgotten outbuilding, not even a memorial. A conscience. The conscience of a family that had made a choice, a courageous, costly, beautiful choice decades ago. A family that had opened its door to someone the rest of the world had turned away. A family that had set one more plate on the dinner table even when the neighbors might never forgive them for it. Harriet had protected this room because it held the evidence of that choice. The proof that ordinary people, in an ordinary decade, had done something extraordinary. Not loudly, not publicly, not for recognition, simply because it was right. Caroline tightened her grip on the iron key. The metal was still warm. It had been warm since the moment she first picked it up, as though 56 years of waiting had generated their own quiet heat. For the first time in many months, perhaps for the first time since Daniel's diagnosis, since the hospital room, since the cemetery, since the locks, since the back seat of the SUV, Caroline Merritt did not feel like a woman who had lost everything. She felt like a woman who had finally arrived at the place where everything that mattered was waiting to be found. The wind shifted. The last autumn leaves released their grip on the apple trees, spiraling downward through golden light. Eli looked up from the orchard, grinning, holding a small apple in each hand, one bruised, one perfect, both offerings. Caroline smiled. Tomorrow she would read more. Tomorrow she would learn what Amos Hale had carried with him to Vermont in 1968, what he had found here, what he had lost, what her grandmother had spent a lifetime protecting. Tomorrow the locked chest would reveal more of its careful, patient truth. But tonight she would make dinner in Harriet's kitchen, sit with Eli at Harriet's table, sleep in a bed instead of a car seat, listen to the silence of a farmhouse that smelled of cedar, the ghost of apple pie. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, she would not tell Eli they were on an adventure, because she was beginning to suspect they were home. Caroline didn't sleep well that first night in Harriet's farmhouse, not because the bed was uncomfortable after weeks in the SUV, any mattress would have felt like mercy, but because her mind refused to quiet itself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image, caught mid-law beneath the apple trees, standing between her grandparents with the ease of a man who had earned his place there through years of steady, unquestioned presence. A man her family had erased. She rose before dawn. The farmhouse was cold. November air seeped through gaps around the window frames, through the spaces where caulk had cracked, through the old bones of a building that had spent decades settling into the Vermont hillside. Caroline wrapped herself in the quilt from the rocking chair, the blue, cream, pale green one she had carried from the shed the evening before, heated water on the gas stove, made coffee in a mug she found in the cupboard above the sink. The mug was white, with a faded illustration of an apple blossom on one side. It fit her hand perfectly, the way certain objects do when they've been shaped by repeated use into something more personal than their maker intended. She carried the coffee across the frost-covered grass. The shed door opened more easily this time, as though it recognized her now. The interior smelled the same cedar, dry paper, the concentrated patience of half a century, but the quality of light had changed. Yesterday's morning sun had entered from the east, casting long horizontal beams across the room. Today the sky was overcast, diffusing the light into something softer, more intimate, the kind of illumination that makes old photographs look alive. Caroline settled into the rocking chair, placed her coffee on the windowsill, lifted Amos Hale's journal from the cedar chest, opened it past the first page she had already read, began the second entry. The handwriting remained steady, deliberate. Each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that language, once committed to paper, outlives the hand that wrote it. Amos described his arrival in Vermont. October 1968. He came by bus, a Greyhound, from a town in upstate New York whose name he never recorded, as though the act of writing it would give the place more power over him than it deserved. He carried a single suitcase, brown leather, a gift from his father, given on the morning Amos had left for college 12 years earlier, back when his father still believed his son's life would follow a predictable arc: education, career, marriage, grandchildren, the comfortable inheritance of expectations. The suitcase was the last thing his father ever gave him. Amos didn't explain immediately why his family had turned him away. He wrote around it the way water flows around a stone, acknowledging its presence through the shape of its absence. His parents stopped returning his letters. Friends he had known since childhood crossed the street when they saw him coming. The church where he had been baptized asked him, through an intermediary, not to attend Sunday services anymore. Not permanently, they said. Just until things settled down. Things never settled down. They rarely do when an entire community decides that one person's existence has become inconvenient. He arrived in Vermont with no plan beyond distance. Enough miles between himself, the whispers, the averted eye, the particular cruelty of people who believe their discomfort justifies another person's exile. He rented a room above a hardware store in a town so small it didn't appear on most maps. He took odd jobs splitting firewood, painting barns, repairing stone walls that had been tumbling since the Civil War. He ate alone, he slept alone. He spent his evenings reading library books by the light of a kerosene lamp, because the wiring in his room couldn't support anything brighter than a 40-watt bulb. Then came the entry that made Caroline stop reading for the second time. The day Gerald invited me to supper was the first time in years someone looked at me without asking me to apologize for being myself. Caroline set the journal in her lap, stared through the shed's eastern window at the orchard, where the overcast sky had turned the bare apple trees into charcoal sketches against a pewter background. She read the sentence again. Not for comprehension, the words were simple enough, but because certain sentences don't deliver their full weight on the first pass. They need to be held, turned over, examined the way you examine a stone pulled from a riverbed, its surface smoothed by years of current into something that fits the palm of your hand, as though it was always meant to rest there. She knew that feeling, the specific bone-deep relief of being looked at without judgment, not praised, not pitied, simply seen. She had felt it so rarely in the past 2 months that she had begun to wonder whether it was something she had invented, a sensation from a kinder chapter of her life that no longer applied. Caroline opened the journal again. As the pages turned, Amos wrote less about himself. His own story, whatever had driven him from his hometown, whatever had cost him his family, his church. His friends receded into the background like a mountain range that is always visible but never approached. Instead, he wrote about Harriet, about Gerald, about the farm. They never treated him like charity. That distinction mattered to Amos. He returned to it several times across different entries, as though he needed to reassure himself, or perhaps reassure whoever would eventually read these pages, that what happened on this farm was not pity dressed in kindness. It was recognition. Gerald saw in Amos a man who knew how to work, who understood soil, who could read the weather and the color of the clouds above the green mountains. Harriet saw in him someone whose loneliness had not yet calcified into bitterness, a man still capable of laughter, still willing to sit at a table where he was welcome, still brave enough to accept what was freely offered without suspecting a hidden cost. Amos worked beside Gerald every morning from that first supper onward. They pruned the apple trees in February, grafted new varieties in March, mended fences through April's mud season, hauled water during the dry summers that arrived every few years like uninvited guests. The three of them sat beneath the oldest apple tree long after sunset, talking about books Gerald had borrowed from the county library, music Harriet played on a second-hand phonograph, the kind of future they hoped the world might someday become. Amos wrote about those Sunday evenings with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. Not because the conversations were extraordinary. They talked about Steinbeck, about Gershwin, about whether the Red Sox would ever win another pennant, but because the ordinariness itself was the miracle. For years, Amos had been treated as someone whose very presence required explanation. At Harriet's table, no explanation was needed. He was simply there, the way the rocking chair was there, the way the apple trees were there, present without apology. Another passage caught Caroline's attention, a longer entry, written in ink that was slightly lighter than the surrounding pages, as though Amos had been using a different pen or writing at a different time of day. People often believe courage means standing in front of crowds. They're wrong. Sometimes courage is simply setting one more plate on the dinner table, even when the neighbors might never forgive you for it. Caroline read those words 3 times. Each reading shifted something inside her, not dramatically, not the way revelations work in movies, with swelling music, the sudden clarity of a life re-examined. The shift was quieter than that, subtler. More like the moment when your eyes adjust to darkness, when shapes that have been formless suddenly acquire edges, depth, dimension. The world doesn't change, your ability to see it does. For weeks she had measured her life by subtraction. Everything she had lost, her husband, her home, her security. Her mother-in-law's approval, which she now understood had always been conditional, a lease rather than a gift, revocable at any time without notice. She had been keeping a mental ledger of deficits, tallying what had been taken, calculating how far she had fallen from the life she had once believed was permanent. But Amos's journal wasn't asking about what had been taken away. It was asking a different question entirely, a harder question, the kind of question that doesn't accept self-pity as legal tender. What kind of person do you choose to become after everything is gone? Caroline closed the journal. Not because she had finished, she was barely a third of the way through, but because she needed to sit with that question before she could continue. Some pages demand silence afterward. Some truths need room to breathe before the next truth arrives. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Outside, Eli pushed the shed door open with his shoulder, carrying 2 small apples in his hands, one slightly bruised, one speckled with frost. His cheeks were red from the cold. His grin was enormous. "One for you," he extended the bruised one. Not out of selfishness, Caroline understood this instinctively, but because the bruised one was the one he had found first, the one he had been carrying longer, the one that had been warmed by his palm. To Eli, the bruised apple was the better gift because it had already been loved. Caroline accepted it, bit into it. The flesh was crisp despite the bruise, tart enough to make her jaw tighten, sweet enough to follow. Eli looked around the shed, his eyes moving across the photographs, the journals, the cedar chest with its lid still open. "Do you think Great-Grandma wanted people to remember this man?" Caroline looked at the black and white photograph hanging on the wall. Amos, Harriet, Gerald, caught in a moment of joy that had somehow survived 56 years of deliberate forgetting. "I think she wanted people to remember how he was loved." The words surprised her. She hadn't planned to say them. They arrived the way certain truths do, not through thought but through recognition, the sudden awareness of something you have always known but never spoken. Eli considered this with the gravity that 9-year-olds sometimes bring to questions adults have spent lifetimes avoiding. That's a good thing to want. He wandered back outside. Caroline watched him through the window, a small blue jacket moving between the gray trunks of the apple trees, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands already reaching for another fallen fruit. She turned back to the journal, resumed reading. The morning passed. The knock came late that afternoon. Caroline was standing in the farmhouse kitchen, attempting to light the old cast-iron stove, a process that involved crumpled newspaper, wooden match, a damper lever that appeared to have been designed by someone who believed fire should require a mechanical engineering degree, when 3 soft knocks sounded against the front door. Not urgent, not hesitant, the knocks of someone who had been visiting this house for decades, whose knuckles knew the exact spot on the door where the wood resonated best. Standing on the porch was an elderly woman carrying a homemade apple pie in a ceramic dish covered with a checkered cloth. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, wire-rimmed glasses, a quilted jacket the color of dried sage. Her face carried the particular beauty of people who have spent their lives outdoors, weathered. Yes, but luminous, the way old wood becomes luminous when it's been polished by years of handling. Her voice was warm without being intrusive, the voice of someone who understood that strangers need space before they need friendship. "My name is Vera Sutton. I lived next door to your grandmother for nearly 40 years. She said lived, present tense turned past by Harriet's absence. Though Vera herself still occupied the property adjacent to the Oaks farm, Caroline could see the roofline of a gray shingled house through the trees at the far edge of the orchard. Caroline invited her inside. They sat at the kitchen table, Harriet's table, scarred with decades of use, its surface carrying the ghost impressions of hot pots, dropped utensils, the elbows of everyone who had ever rested them there while waiting for coffee to brew. Vera declined coffee but accepted a glass of water. She held it with both hands, the way people hold things when they're preparing to say something they've been carrying for a long time. Her eyes moved toward the window that faced the orchard, toward the shed barely visible through the bare branches. "I was wondering when someone would finally open that shed." Caroline set down her own mug. "You knew about it?" Vera's nod was slow, weighted with the particular heaviness of long-held confidence. "Everyone in town knew about the shed, but your grandmother rarely spoke of what was inside." She paused, adjusted her glasses. "She used to say that some stories aren't meant to be inherited until someone has lived enough life to understand them." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that forms when 2 people recognize they are standing at the edge of the same deep water. Caroline leaned forward. "I found the letters, the photographs, the journals. I found Amos." Vera's expression didn't change, no surprise, no alarm. Only the quiet confirmation of someone who had been expecting this conversation for years, the way a farmer expects rain when the barometer drops, not with anxiety, but with patience. Harriet loved that place, not because of the letters. Vera looked directly at Caroline for the first time, because of what they reminded her to become. Those words carried a weight that Caroline felt settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She opened her mouth to ask another question. Who was Amos, really? Why did the family erase him? What did Harriet know that she never told anyone? But Vera was already rising from her chair, placing her water glass beside the sink with the familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times. At the door, Vera paused. Her hand rested on the knob. Without turning around, her voice dropped to something just above a whisper. Amos didn't disappear in 1995 the way people think. Someone found him in his final years. Someone visited him. Someone sat beside him. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The person who went to him, you'd never guess who it was. Then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her. The kitchen settled back into its silence. The cast-iron stove ticked as the metal cooled. Caroline stood motionless for a long time. Vera had offered no names, no explanations, only the outline of a secret whose full shape remained hidden. A door cracked open just wide enough to let light through without revealing what lay behind it. The following days settled into a rhythm that Caroline hadn't known she needed. Every morning before Eli woke, she crossed the frost-covered grass to the shed, unlocked the door with the iron key she now carried in her jacket pocket at all times, sat in the rocking chair, read another handful of letters, another journal entry. Eli explored the orchard, building small fortresses from fallen branches, collecting stones with unusual colors, sorting apples by size along the porch railing. Sometimes he sat beside Caroline while she read, asking questions with the unfiltered directness that only children possess. Do you think Amos ever felt lonely? I think he probably did. Did Great-Grandma know he was sad? I think that's why she kept all of this, because she wanted someone to know that his sadness wasn't the whole story. Did people ever tell him he didn't belong? Caroline looked at her son. His face held no malice, no agenda. Just the pure curiosity of a child trying to understand why the world sometimes refuses to make room for people who deserve it. I think they probably did. Eli considered this. His brow furrowed the way it did when he was working through a math problem that didn't have a clean answer. I'm glad Grandma didn't. So am I. Word spread through the small town the way things always spread in communities, where everyone knows everyone else's business, not through announcements but through observation. The mail carrier noticed lights on at the Oaks farm for the first time in years. The woman who ran the general store mentioned to a customer that she'd seen a silver SUV in the driveway. Someone at the volunteer fire department told someone at the feed store, who told someone at the church, who told their neighbor, who happened to be married to the man who delivered propane. Within a week, visitors began arriving, not crowds, not curiosity seekers, just neighbors, carrying the particular offerings that rural communities bring when someone new occupies a familiar house: a paper bag of butternut squash, a jar of maple syrup with a handwritten label, a casserole in a dish that didn't need to be returned. A retired carpenter named Holt Berenger appeared one morning with a toolbox, inspected the sagging porch roof, returned the next day with lumber. He didn't ask for payment. He simply remembered that Harriet had once driven 40 minutes through a snowstorm to bring his wife soup when she was ill, so he owed the porch at least that much. Another neighbor, a woman named June, who spoke very little but smiled frequently, replaced the broken window in the shed without being asked. She measured the frame, drove to the hardware store, returned with a pane of glass cut to the exact dimensions, installed it in under an hour. When Caroline tried to thank her, June simply waved her hand as though gratitude was an unnecessary formality between people who shared the same road. Caroline began to understand something she had never considered before. Harriet's greatest legacy had not been measured in acres or appraised by county assessors. It had been measured in people, in relationships built through decades of small, consistent, unremarkable acts of generosity, the kind that don't make headlines, that no one records, that simply accumulate over time like snowfall. Each flake insignificant alone but transformative in sum. The farm wasn't just land. It was a web of obligations, gratitudes, memories, invisible threads connecting Harriet to every person who had ever stood in her kitchen, eaten at her table, been seen by her without judgment. Those threads hadn't broken when Harriet died. They had simply been waiting for someone to pick them up. On the 9th morning, Caroline found Gerald's letters. She had been working through the cedar chest methodically, Amos's journal first, then Harriet's correspondence, arranged chronologically by decade. Gerald's letters had been bundled separately, tied with a piece of twine that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Most were addressed to Harriet, written during the occasional weeks when Gerald traveled to agricultural conferences in neighboring states. They were practical documents, updates on weather conditions, crop prices, equipment repairs, needed punctuated by brief expressions of affection, so understated they were almost invisible. The hotel bed is too large without you. I forgot how quiet breakfast is when no one argues with me about whether Frost is a better poet than Whitman. Then Caroline found the letter that changed everything she thought she understood about Amos Hale. Dated March 1972, written on hotel stationery from a motor inn in Albany. Gerald's handwriting heavier than Harriet's, more The penmanship of a man who held his pen the way he held his pruning shears, with firm purpose. I know what people are saying about Amos. I've heard it for 4 years now. I heard it again last week at the co-op when Bill Hadley pulled me aside with that look on his face, you know the one. The look men get when they believe they're doing you a favor by repeating gossip they have no right to repeat. I didn't answer him. Not because I don't have an answer, but because the answer isn't his to hear. I know why they talk, Harriet. I know what they think they see. I know what they believe about a man who arrives alone, who keeps to himself, whose family won't claim him, whose hometown whispers about him the way people whisper about things they're afraid to say out loud. But I also know what they don't say, that the man they gossip about saved our orchard 2 winters running when I was too sick to lift a pruning saw, that he's never asked for a single dollar in return, that our daughter calls him Uncle Amos before she calls me by name most mornings, because he's the one who makes her oatmeal while I'm still pulling on my boots. Let them talk. Some people would rather be right than kind. I'd rather set one more plate at the table. Caroline's hands were shaking when she finished reading, not from cold, not from fatigue, from the slow building pressure of understanding something that had been hidden in plain sight. Amos wasn't a mystery because of what he had done. He was a mystery because of what the community had decided about him without evidence, without trial, without the basic decency of asking him directly. They had looked at a man who didn't fit their expectations, a man alone, different in ways they couldn't or wouldn't articulate, made their judgment, delivered their verdict. Gerald had known. He had heard every whisper, every insinuation, every raised eyebrow at the feed store. He understood the cost of keeping Amos at his table, the social currency he was spending, the relationships he was straining, the quiet war he was waging simply by refusing to treat another human being as a problem to be solved. He had chosen the table, that choice ordinary on its surface, revolutionary in its context, was the courage Harriet had written about on the back of the photograph, not the courage of battlefields or courtrooms, the courage of the dinner plate, the courage of the extra chair, the courage of looking your neighbor in the eye, knowing he disapproves, choosing kindness over compliance. Caroline placed Gerald's letter back inside the bundle with extraordinary care, as though the paper itself were made of something more fragile than cellulose. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time without moving, watching the overcast sky through the eastern window, listening to the wind in the apple trees. The knock came 3 days later. This time it wasn't Vera. It wasn't Holt the carpenter or June with her measuring tape, or any of the neighbors who had become familiar enough that Caroline recognized their footsteps on the porch. This was an old man, very old, 82. She would learn later, with a weathered face, thinning white hair beneath a tweed cap, hands spotted with age, eyes so pale blue they seemed to hold their own light. He stood on the porch with the careful posture of someone who had driven a long distance to say something he had been carrying for decades. In his right hand he held a faded photograph. His voice was thin but steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. "My name is Roy Callahan. I heard Eleanor Whitfield's granddaughter had come back to the farm." Eleanor Whitfield. No one had called Harriet by that name, her maiden name, since before her marriage. Roy Callahan had known her grandmother before she became Harriet Oakes, before Gerald, before the farm, before everything. She invited him inside. Roy declined a chair. He seemed to prefer standing, as though sitting down would make this visit feel social rather than sacred. He looked around the kitchen slowly, his gaze stopping at the window that faced the orchard. "I haven't been inside this house in over 50 years. His eyes drifted toward something only he could see, a memory layered over the present, the way old films sometimes burn through to a previous exposure, creating an image that belongs to 2 moments simultaneously. "I was 7 years old the first time I met Amos Hale." Roy removed his cap, held it against his chest. "He was the gentlest soul I've ever known. He taught me how to prune apple trees. He showed me which branches to cut, which ones to leave, how to read the shape of the tree to know where it wanted to grow." A smile crossed his face, not nostalgic, not sentimental, but the smile of someone remembering a moment of uncomplicated goodness. "My father brought me here every Saturday. He never explained why, he just said Mr. Hale needed help in the orchard. I didn't know until I was much older that my father was the one who needed help. He needed his son to see what a good man looked like before the world taught him to stop looking." Roy's voice trembled. His pale blue eyes glistened. "My father told me never to repeat the ugly things people said about Amos. He said good people deserved to be remembered for the lives they lived, not the rumors they survived." Caroline felt tears building behind her eyes. For the first time, Amos was no longer simply a man inside old journals. Someone else had carried his story. Someone else's father had made a choice, the same kind of choice Gerald had made, to bring his child into the orbit of a man the rest of the town had decided to shun. Roy reached into his jacket pocket. His hand moved slowly with the deliberate care of someone handling something irreplaceable. I've kept this for decades. Never showed it to anyone. Never knew who to give it to. He placed the photograph in Caroline's hands. It was smaller than the others she had found wallet-sized, its edges worn soft from years of being carried. The image showed Amos sitting alone on the farmhouse porch steps looking out toward the orchard. Late afternoon light. Long shadows. His expression was not sad exactly, but contemplative, the face of a man taking inventory of something invisible, counting blessings he had never expected to receive. Caroline turned the photograph over. 6 words, handwritten, the same deliberate penmanship she had written for days. Thank you for giving me home. No signature, no date. Caroline studied the handwriting, compared it mentally to the pages she had read that morning, the pages she had read the day before, the sentence on the first page of the journal. The match was unmistakable. Amos had written those words, not to Roy, not to Gerald, not to Harriet. He had written them to himself, a private affirmation inscribed on the back of his own photograph, a reminder that the place he had found, the table where he was welcome, the orchard where he worked, the people who had claimed him, all of it was real, not temporary, not conditional. Home. Roy placed his cap back on his head, adjusted the brim, moved toward the door with the measured steps of a man who had completed a task he had been saving for the right moment. At the threshold he turned back. His voice dropped. Amos didn't die here. He left Vermont in '95. No one knew why, no one knew where. But he didn't die alone. Roy's eyes met Caroline's. I know because I was the one who got the phone call, 1998, a hospital in New Hampshire. They found my name in his wallet on a piece of paper folded behind that photograph. He nodded once. Someone was with him at the end. Someone who came every year after he left. Someone none of us expected. He pulled his collar up against the cold. Your grandmother's neighbor might know more than she's letting on. Then Roy Callahan walked down the porch steps, climbed into a faded blue pickup truck, drove away without looking back. The gravel crunched beneath his tires, the sound faded. The farm settled back into its particular brand of silence, not empty, never truly empty, but populated by the echoes of people who had loved this place too deeply to ever fully leave it. Caroline stood in the doorway holding Amos's photograph. The afternoon light was fading. November shadows stretched long across the orchard. Somewhere among those trees, Eli was building something. She could hear the rhythmic clap of sticks being stacked, his voice narrating an imaginary scenario to an audience of apple trees. She looked at the photograph one more time, then at the shed, its silhouette darkening against the gray sky. Something had shifted, not inside the shed, inside Caroline. The journals, the letters, Gerald's confession, Roy's, Vera's unfinished hints. They were forming a picture. Not of Amos Hale alone, but of an entire community's relationship with courage. Some people had chosen it. Others had refused. The ones who chose it, Gerald, Harriet, Roy's, perhaps others whose names she hadn't yet found, had paid a price for their choice. Social friction, gossip, the quiet exile that comes from refusing to participate in a collective cruelty. The ones who refused had paid nothing, which is exactly why their version of events had survived for 50 years while Amos's name had been buried. Until now. That evening, something inside Caroline made a decision her conscious mind hadn't yet approved. She called Grady Farnsworth. When he answered, she apologized politely. I'm going to need a little more time. A brief silence on the other end. I thought you wanted to list the property this week. I did. Caroline looked through the kitchen window toward the shed, barely visible now in the gathering dusk. But I think my grandmother left me something I haven't finished opening yet. The agent's response was professional, measured. As long as you understand, the market could change. I know. She hung up, slipped the phone into her pocket. The stack of unpaid bills still sat on the kitchen table. They hadn't disappeared. They wouldn't. But for the first time in months, Caroline wasn't making a decision based on fear. She was making a decision based on something she couldn't yet name, something that existed in the space between obligation, curiosity, the growing suspicion that Harriet Oakes had never intended for this land to be sold at all. The next afternoon, Caroline, Roy Callahan, who returned without being asked, carrying a bucket of warm soapy water, a reverence for the space that required no explanation, cleaned the shed together. They didn't speak much. The work itself was a kind of conversation. Caroline dusted the shelves one by one, lifting each object, wiping the wood beneath it, replacing the object in its exact position. Eli cleaned the picture frames with the meticulous attention of a child who understood that these faces belonged to real people who deserved real care. Roy washed the windows inside, then outside, his movements slow, the practiced motions of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. By late afternoon, sunlight poured through the freshly cleaned glass, filling the shed with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Dust no longer danced in the light. It had been swept, wiped, removed. The cedar chest gleamed. The brass lantern reflected the afternoon sun. The quilt on the rocking chair looked brighter, its colors deepened by the cleaning, as though the fabric itself had been holding its breath. Eli stepped back, surveyed the room with the critical eye of a 9-year-old art director. His grin spread slowly across his face. It feels alive now. Caroline looked at the shed she had first entered less than 2 weeks ago, believing it was nothing more than a storage building on a property she planned to sell. The photographs on the walls, the journals in the chest, the careful, deliberate arrangement of every object. A room that had been prepared not hastily, not carelessly, but with the focused intention of someone who believed that the future would eventually send the right person through that door. "No," she answered softly. "I think it always was." Roy said nothing. He simply hung his damp cloth over the windowsill, placed his hand briefly on the lid of the cedar chest, a gesture so private Caroline almost looked away, put on his cap. Once, walked home. That evening, while Eli drew pictures of apple trees at the kitchen table, Caroline returned to the shed alone. She carried a plain notebook, spiral-bound, college-ruled, purchased from the general store that morning for $2.39, a ballpoint pen, a small wooden stand she had found in the farmhouse closet. She placed the notebook on the workbench. Beside it, she wrote a simple sign on a piece of cardstock, pressing hard enough that the letters were legible even in the shed's dim light. "If this place reminds you of someone you've loved, or someone the world forgot, you're welcome to leave their story here." It wasn't a museum. It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't a nonprofit application or a community proposal or anything that required a board of directors, a mission statement, a budget. It was simply an invitation, an open door. The first person to write in the notebook was Eli. He came into the shed the next morning before breakfast while Caroline was reading another section of Amos's journal. He didn't ask permission. He simply walked to the workbench, picked up the pen, opened the notebook to its first blank page, wrote a single sentence in careful, uneven handwriting, the handwriting of a child who is concentrating so hard on forming each letter that his tongue presses against his lower lip. "My dad would have liked this place." Caroline read the sentence twice. Then she closed the notebook gently, pressing the cover flat, holding it there for a moment the way you hold a door shut against wind, not because it needs to be closed, but because you need a moment before you're ready to open it again. She realized something with a clarity that felt almost physical, almost spatial, as though a wall she hadn't known was there had quietly dissolved. While she had spent weeks searching for a new home, calculating square footage, comparing rental listings, measuring her life against the dimensions of apartments she couldn't afford, Eli had already found one. He had found it here, in a shed full of old letters, in an orchard full of unpicked apples, in the story of a man he had never met but whose absence from the family's memory made him more present, not less. 9-year-olds possess a compass that adults spend decades trying to recalibrate. They don't analyze, they don't strategize. They simply recognize what feels right, not through calculation, but through alignment with something fundamental. The morning of the 14th day began like all the others: coffee, frost, the walk across the orchard, the cedar-scented room. But something was different. Caroline felt it before she saw it. A disruption in the rhythm of the farm, subtle but unmistakable, the way animals sense a storm before the first cloud appears. She was standing on the farmhouse porch, watching Eli arrange stones along the walkway, when a black sedan turned off the main road onto the dirt track that led to the property. Not a pickup truck. Not the kind of car anyone in this town drove, a sedan with tinted windows clean enough to suggest it had been washed that morning, carrying plates from out of state. The car stopped beside the SUV. The engine idled for a moment. Then the driver's door opened. A man, 40s, gray suit, no tie, leather briefcase. The shoes were wrong for Vermont, polished, the kind of shoes that belong on marble floors, not frozen dirt. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who bills by the hour. Then the passenger door opened. Dorothea Merritt stepped onto the frozen ground. She looked smaller than Caroline remembered, diminished in some way that had nothing to do with physical size, as though the 2 months since the funeral had consumed something essential, some internal scaffolding that had previously held her upright. Her coat was expensive. Her gloves were leather. Her expression was the carefully composed mask of a woman who had rehearsed this visit the way generals rehearse campaigns, every word pre-selected, every response anticipated, every contingency mapped. She did not look toward the shed. She did not look toward the orchard where Eli had stopped arranging his stones, where he stood perfectly still, watching the grandmother who had changed his locks without saying goodbye. Dorothea looked only at Caroline. Her voice carried the temperature of the November air, controlled, measured, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for warmth. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to be practical. The attorney opened his briefcase. On the hood of the sedan, documents appeared, highlighted paragraphs, sticky tabs marking specific clauses. He spoke in the flat, practiced cadence of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as bad, simply as information, neutral as arithmetic. The situation, he explained, was straightforward. Daniel Merritt's death had left outstanding obligations. Medical bills, a line of credit secured against the family trust, credit card balances accumulated during the final months of treatment. These debts belonged to the marriage, which meant they belonged, in part, to Caroline. The inherited property in Vermont, while held in a separate trust established by Harriet Oakes, could potentially be subject to claims if the estate's obligations remained unresolved. The legal theory was aggressive but not frivolous. A court might agree, a court might not. Litigation would take months, perhaps, during which time the property would be encumbered, unsellable, unmortgageable, frozen. Dorothea watched Caroline's face while the attorney spoke, the way a chess player watches an opponent's hands during the opening moves. Caroline heard every word, understood every implication. The message beneath the legal language was simple: sell the land, pay the debts, walk away with whatever remains. Be practical, be reasonable, be the kind of woman who recognizes when she has lost. She looked past Dorothea, past the attorney, past the black sedan with its out-of-state plates. She looked toward the shed. Its weathered red paint was barely visible in the fading afternoon light. One shutter hung crooked, the roof dipped. Moss crept along the northern wall. Inside that shed, a cedar chest held the journals of a man who had been told by his parents, his church, his entire hometown, that he didn't belong, that he was inconvenient, that the world would be simpler, cleaner, more comfortable if he simply agreed to disappear. Amos Hale had refused. Gerald Oakes had refused on his behalf. Harriet had spent 30 years protecting the evidence of that refusal. Now Dorothea Merritt, standing on frozen ground in shoes that cost more than Caroline's monthly grocery budget during the week she lived in her car, was asking her to do what Amos's family had asked him to do. Surrender, comply, accept that belonging was a privilege extended by people with power, revocable at their discretion. Caroline felt something shift beneath her feet. Not the ground was solid, frozen, dependable in the way that Vermont soil has been dependable for centuries. What shifted was something internal, something that had been building since the first moment she lifted the iron key from the lid of the cedar chest. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue with the attorney. She didn't produce counter-documents or threaten legal action of her own. She simply stood on the porch her grandmother had swept 10,000 times, wrapped in the quilt her grandmother had folded across the rocking chair, holding the iron key her grandmother had placed on top of a locked chest in a shed that her grandmother had prepared for exactly this moment, the moment when someone would need to decide whether courage meant standing in front of a crowd or simply refusing to leave. Her voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that carries farther than shouting because it comes from deeper. I understand what you're asking. I need you to understand what I'm choosing. She turned away from the sedan, from the attorney, from Dorothea's carefully composed face. Walked down the porch steps, crossed the frozen grass toward the shed, didn't look back. Eli remained standing among his carefully arranged stones, watching his grandmother with an expression that contained no anger, no fear, only the focused attention of a child who is learning, in real time, how the people he loves behave when the world asks them to become smaller than they are. The black sedan remained in the driveway until the last light left the sky. Then, without ceremony, its headlights cut through the darkness, its tires crunched over the frozen gravel, its taillights shrank to red points in the distance before disappearing around the bend. Caroline sat alone in the shed. The iron key rested in her lap. The cedar chest was closed. The photograph of Amos, Harriet, Gerald watched her from the wall, 3 people who had chosen courage over comfort in a decade when that choice could cost you everything. She didn't know yet how she would fight. She didn't know what legal tools she possessed, what protections Harriet might have built into the trust, what resources this small community might offer. She didn't know if she would win. But she knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has spent 2 months losing everything she once believed was permanent that she would not sell this land. She would not close this shed. She would not lock the cedar chest, bury the journals, silence the story that Harriet Oakes had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly the right person to hear. Outside, the wind moved through the orchard. The bare branches of the apple trees creaked softly, not the sound of breaking, but the sound of holding. The sound of things that have endured winters before, that know how to bend without snapping, that understand that survival is not the absence of storms, but the decision to remain standing after each one passes. Caroline closed her eyes. breathed in the scent of cedar, dry paper, the ghost of apple blossoms that wouldn't bloom for another 5 months. When she opened them, Eli was standing in the doorway, his small silhouette framed by the last purple light of the November sky. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what the woman in the expensive coat had wanted. He simply walked across the wooden floor, down beside his mother on the cold planks, leaned his head against her shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time. Two people in a shed full of stories, surrounded by the evidence of lives that had refused to be erased. The iron key was warm in Caroline's hand. It had been warm since the day she first picked it up. She was only now beginning to understand why. Vera Sutton arrived after dark. No knock this time, just the soft click of the farmhouse door opening, the familiar creak of floorboards beneath feet that had memorized the location of every loose board decades before Caroline was born. The kitchen was dim, a single bulb above the stove casting a circle of amber light across the table where Caroline sat alone, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, the iron key resting beside her on the scarred wooden surface. Eli was asleep upstairs. Caroline had carried him there from the shed, his small body heavy with the particular weight of children who fall asleep mid-sentence, their consciousness yielding to exhaustion without negotiation. She had pulled the blue blanket to his chin, stood in the doorway watching his chest rise, fall, rise again, the metronomic reassurance of a child breathing in a house that was not yet theirs, on land that might be taken from them by morning. Vera placed something on the table between them, a manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape that had dried to a brittle amber. Across the front, in handwriting Caroline now recognized the way she recognized her own heartbeat, were 4 words. For when she needs it. Harriet gave this to me in 2019. Vera spoke without sitting down, her voice carrying the solemn cadence of someone fulfilling an oath. 5 years before she died, she told me to hold it until the day her granddaughter came to Vermont, not the day she inherited the land, the day she came. She said there was a difference. Caroline stared at the envelope. 5 years. Harriet had prepared this 5 years before her death, entrusted it to a neighbor who had kept the secret for half a decade without asking what was inside, without breaking the seal, without ever knowing whether the person it was meant for would actually arrive. That kind of patience wasn't human patience. It was the patience of root systems, of geological formations, of things that operate on timescales longer than any single life. Caroline broke the seal. Inside was a single document, crisp, official, bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Montpelier. She wasn't a lawyer, but she understood enough to recognize what she was holding. The Oakes Family Land Trust, established in 2019 by Harriet Oakes with the assistance of a probate attorney named Margaret Hensley, placed the 11-acre property into an irrevocable trust with Caroline Merritt named as sole beneficiary. The trust was structured independently of any marital estate, any spousal debt, any claim that might arise from Daniel Merritt's financial obligations. The language was precise, deliberate, fortified against exactly the kind of legal maneuvering Dorothea's attorney had attempted that afternoon. Harriet hadn't simply left Caroline land, she had built a fortress around it. Caroline read the document twice, set it down, looked at Vera, who remained standing in the same spot, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carrying neither triumph nor relief, only the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. She knew this would happen. Caroline's voice was barely audible. She knew someone would try to take it. Vera's response was measured. Your grandmother spent her entire life watching what happened when good people failed to protect the things that mattered. She wasn't going to make that mistake twice. The word landed with unexpected force. Twice, not once, twice, as though there had been an earlier failure, an earlier loss, an earlier moment when something precious had slipped through unprotected hands. Caroline opened her mouth to ask what Vera meant, but the older woman was already moving toward the door, pulling on her quilted jacket with the unhurried movements of someone who had stayed precisely long enough. There's one more thing you need to know. Vera paused at the threshold. But not tonight. Tonight you should sleep. Tomorrow bring the woman in the expensive coat back to the farm. Don't bring lawyers. Don't bring documents. Just bring her to the shed. Then Vera was gone. The door closed. The kitchen settled into the particular silence that follows the departure of someone who has altered the shape of everything simply by placing an envelope on a table. Caroline sat with the trust document for another hour. She didn't read it again. She didn't need to. The legal protections were important, vital even, but they weren't what kept her sitting motionless in the amber light. What held her there was the realization of how long Harriet had been planning this. Not weeks, not months. Years, perhaps decades. Every arrangement, the shed, the journals, the cedar chest, the trust, the instructions. The neighbor entrusted with the final piece had been constructed with the painstaking precision of a woman building something she knew she wouldn't live to see completed. Harriet hadn't left Caroline an inheritance. She had left her an architecture, a structure designed to hold weight that hadn't been placed on it yet. Weight that was arriving now, in the form of a grieving woman, a sleeping child, a locked and open question. She went to bed. For the first time since Dorothea's arrival, she slept without dreaming. The morning was sharp. Frost had thickened overnight into something closer to ice, glazing the orchard in a brittle shell that cracked like glass beneath Caroline's boots as she crossed to the mailbox at the end of the dirt road. The mountains to the west were invisible behind a wall of low clouds. The air tasted of iron, of cold water, of the particular mineral clarity that arrives when the temperature drops below 20 degrees. She found Dorothea at the bed and breakfast in town, the only lodging within 15 miles, a converted Victorian farmhouse run by a woman named Alma, who had known Harriet since childhood. Caroline knocked on the front door at 8 o'clock. Alma answered, studied Caroline's face for a long moment, then simply pointed upstairs. Dorothea was sitting on the edge of a neatly made bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The attorney was gone. His rental car had left sometime during the night, its tire tracks frozen into the gravel of Alma's driveway. Without her lawyer, without her legal documents, without the institutional armor she had worn the previous afternoon, Dorothea looked like what she actually was, a 71-year-old woman who had buried her only son 2 months ago, who had responded to that grief by doing the only thing she knew how to do, controlling what remained. Caroline stood in the doorway. She didn't enter the room, didn't need to. The conversation she came to have required very few words. "I'd like you to come back to the farm this morning." Dorothea's eyes flickered surprise. The rapid calculation of someone trying to determine whether an invitation is a trap. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss." "There isn't. There's something to see." A long pause. Dorothea's fingers tightened on the bedspread. Whatever she had expected from Caroline, anger, a counter-threat, the cold efficiency of a lawyer's cease-and-desist letter, an invitation hadn't been on the list. "You don't owe me this." Dorothea's voice dropped to something rawer than Caroline had ever heard from her. Not vulnerability exactly. More like the edge of it, the sound of a wall developing its first crack. "No, I don't." Caroline turned, walked back down the stairs, drove to the farm, left the decision where it belonged in the hands of the woman who needed to make it. 40 minutes later, Dorothea's rental car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out slowly, as though the frozen ground might give way beneath her. She carried nothing except a cardboard box, the same box she had brought the day before, the one the attorney had used to organize his documents. Caroline noticed that the legal files were gone. The box now held something else. She could see the edges of picture frames, the corner of a photo album, the spine of what appeared to be a leather date book. They walked to the shed without speaking. The orchard was quiet. Even the wind had stilled, as though the landscape itself was holding space for whatever was about to happen. Caroline lifted the iron latch, pushed the door open, stepped aside. Dorothea entered the shed the way people enter churches, slowly, with the involuntary reverence that comes from recognizing you have stepped into a space that holds more than its physical dimensions suggest. Her eyes moved across the shelves, the photographs, the cedar chest, the rocking chair, the brass lantern catching the morning light. She stopped in front of the black and white photograph of Harriet, Gerald, Amos, the three of them frozen in a moment of laughter beneath apple trees that still stood outside. She studied the photograph for a long time without speaking. Her jaw tightened. Her shoulders drew slightly inward. Whatever she was feeling, she kept it beneath the surface, a lifetime's practice of composure, holding firm even as the foundations beneath it shifted. Caroline didn't narrate, didn't explain who Amos was, what the journals contained, what the letters revealed. She simply waited. The shed would speak for itself. Harriet had designed it that way. Dorothea turned from the photograph. She looked at the box in her own hands as though remembering it for the first time. She set it on the workbench beside the cedar chest. Her fingers lingered on the cardboard flap. "I brought these because the attorney told me photographs of Daniel's possessions could establish joint assets." Her voice carried the hollow echo of a strategy that now embarrassed her. "But last night I opened the box for a different reason." She lifted the cardboard flap. Inside were photographs. Caroline had never seen images that must have been stored at Dorothea's house. In albums Caroline had never been invited to look through. In rooms of the Merritt home she had never been welcome to enter. Daniel as a child, perhaps 6 years old, sitting on a tractor with a gap-toothed grin so wide it seemed to push his ears upward. Daniel at his college graduation, mortarboard slightly crooked, his face carrying the particular confidence of a young man who believed the world was arranged in his favor. Daniel on his wedding day, not Caroline's wedding day, Not the photograph she remembered, but a different angle, taken from behind the altar, showing Daniel's face at the exact moment Caroline appeared at the end of the aisle. His expression in that photograph was one she had never witnessed from the front. From the front, she had seen composure, the reassuring smile of a man ready to begin. From behind, the camera had captured what his face did when he thought no one was watching, his eyes wide, his lips parted, his entire body leaned forward almost imperceptibly, drawn toward her by something stronger than ceremony. Caroline held the photograph with both hands, the edges trembled. Not because she was crying, she wasn't. Not yet, but because the image had bypassed her defenses entirely, arriving at the grief she had been managing for months, the grief she had packed into neat compartments labeled bills, housing, Eli's school, next steps, the grief she had converted into logistics because logistics could be solved while grief could only be endured. Then she found the photograph that changed everything. Beneath the wedding pictures, beneath the childhood images, beneath a layer of tissue paper that Dorothea must have placed there with deliberate care, was a photograph Caroline had never imagined existed. It showed two people standing together in the oak's orchard, the apple trees heavy with fruit, the late summer light golden, the farmhouse visible in the background with its white clapboard siding freshly painted. Daniel Merritt, standing beside Harriet Oakes. They weren't posing. The photograph had been taken candidly by whom Caroline couldn't guess, catching them mid-conversation, both looking toward the shed at the far edge of the property. Daniel's hand rested on the orchard fence. Harriet's hand rested beside his, close enough that their fingers almost touched. The date penciled on the back in Daniel's handwriting read August 2015. Caroline felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Not physically, the shed was as solid as it had been since the day Gerald built it, but in the deeper sense of a reality rearranging itself, familiar shapes dissolving into new configurations. Daniel had been here, 9 years before Caroline's arrival. He had stood in this orchard, looked at this shed, spoken with this woman, Caroline's own grandmother, a woman Caroline barely remembered without ever mentioning it. Not once, not in passing, not during the years of marriage that followed, not during his illness, not during the final weeks when people are supposed to say the things they've been saving. He had kept this to himself. Not as a secret held in malice, but as a truth held in trust, the way you hold a seed, not because you're hiding it, but because the soil isn't ready yet. Caroline looked at Dorothea. "How long have you known?" "I found the photograph 3 days ago." Dorothea's voice was stripped of its usual precision. "In a box Daniel left in the attic. A box I never opened because it was labeled personal papers. I assumed it meant insurance forms, tax receipts. Instead, it was full of these." She gestured toward the cardboard box. "Photographs. Letters I'd never read. A plane ticket stub to Burlington dated 2015, the same summer he told me he was visiting a college friend in New Hampshire." Silence filled the shed. Not the adversarial silence of their previous encounters, the holding silence of two women standing on opposite sides of a grief they had never shared, recognizing for the first time that the wall between them had been built from misunderstanding rather than malice. Caroline reached deeper into the box. Her fingers found something small, folded, tucked into a side pocket of the photo album where it might have gone unnoticed for another decade. A single sheet of cream-colored stationery. The handwriting belonged to Harriet. The letter was addressed to Daniel. It had never been mailed. There was no envelope, no stamp, no postmark. But the paper told its own story. The fold lines were deep, worn soft at the kind of wear that comes from being opened, read, refolded, opened again dozens of times, per hundreds, over the course of years. Daniel had received this letter somehow. He had kept it. He had returned to it the way people return to prayers, not for new information, but for the reassurance that the words still held. Caroline unfolded the page. Harriet's handwriting filled only 3 lines. 3 lines that contained more than 3 volumes could have held. "You already know Caroline will find her way here. You don't need to tell her. Some people are simply born knowing how to open doors." Caroline read the sentence once. Then she couldn't read anymore because her vision dissolved. The tears arrived without permission, without warning, without the controlled release she had practiced for months, the careful, private crying she did in bathroom stalls, in parked cars, in the shower where the water covered the sound. This was different. This came from somewhere below the place where control lives, from the geological layer of a person where grief is stored not as emotion but as pressure, building silently over weeks, months, until a single fracture releases everything at once. Daniel had known. He had visited this farm. He had met Harriet. He had walked through this orchard, looked at this shed, understood, perhaps not fully, perhaps only in the intuitive way that people who love each other understand things they cannot explain, that Caroline would eventually stand in this exact spot, holding this exact letter. making this exact discovery. He had carried that knowledge with him for 9 years. Through their marriage, through Eli's childhood, through his diagnosis, through the hospital rooms, the treatments that didn't work, the conversations about what would happen after. He had never told her about Vermont, about the farm, about the grandmother she barely remembered. Not because he was hiding something from her, but because he trusted something about her, the same thing Harriet had trusted, that she would find her way here on her own, that she didn't need to be told, that the same quality Harriet had seen in her, whatever it was, whatever unnamed capacity for opening locked doors, for entering rooms that had been sealed for decades, for hearing the voices of people who could no longer speak for themselves, would eventually bring her to this shed, this moment. Some people are simply born knowing how to open doors. Caroline lowered the letter, looked at Dorothea. The older woman was standing completely still, her arms at her side, her expensive coat hanging open, her face stripped of every defense she had constructed over 71 years of refusing to appear vulnerable. She was reading the letter over Caroline's shoulder. She had read it twice. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet it barely displaced the air. "He never told me either," 4 words. But they carried the accumulated weight of every mistake Dorothea had made since her son's death, the locked doors, the legal threats, the 72-hour eviction notice, the attorney in the gray suit. Every act of control she had exercised over Caroline had been, she now understood, an attempt to manage a grief she had no tools to process. She had lost her son. The loss was total, irreversible, beyond the reach of money, lawyers, family trust. So she had reached for the only thing she could still control, the people Daniel had left behind. She had punished Caroline for surviving. Dorothea moved toward the rocking chair. She didn't sit with authority, the way she sat in boardrooms, at dinner tables, in the leather chairs of lawyers' offices. She lowered herself into it slowly, the way you sit when you're not sure the structure will hold you, not because it's fragile, but because you're not sure you deserve to be held. The chair accepted her weight without complaint. It had been built to hold people. That was its entire purpose. Her hands gripped the armrests, her chin dropped. When she spoke again, each word seemed to cost her something: pride, the carefully maintained fiction that she had acted reasonably. "I can't change what I did." She paused, drew a breath that shuddered on its way in. "But I wanted to tell you I'm sorry." The words hung in the cedar-scented air. No one moved. Outside, a single bird called from the orchard, one clear note held, then released into silence. Caroline looked at the photograph of Harriet, Gerald, Amos, the 3 of them laughing beneath apple trees that had witnessed more courage than most courthouses. She looked at the cedar chest, the journals, the bundles of letters tied with cotton string. She looked at the quilt draped across the back of the chair where Dorothea now sat, a quilt Harriet had folded with the same hands that had written the note, locked the chest, placed the key on its lid. Then she looked at Dorothea, not with anger, not with forgiveness. Exactly, forgiveness is a process, not a moment, a river rather than a switch. She looked at her with something closer to recognition. The recognition of one wounded person seeing another. Her voice was steady, calm, carrying a resonance that came not from volume but from depth, the kind of quiet that emerges when someone speaks from the truest part of themselves. Neither did Amos. 2 words, that was all. But Dorothea understood them immediately, understood that Caroline was not comparing their situations, not equating a mother-in-law's cruelty with a community's decades-long rejection. She was doing something more subtle, more generous. She was pointing toward the central truth of everything this shed contained, that forgiveness is not something the forgiven earns. It is something the forgiver chooses, not because the pain has healed, not because justice has been served, but because carrying the weight of resentment requires more strength than letting it go, more years than most people have left. Amos had never deserved what happened to him. Dorothea hadn't deserved Caroline's grace. Grace, by definition, is undeserved. That is what makes it grace. Dorothea sat in the rocking chair for a long time. Caroline didn't ask her to leave, didn't ask her to stay, simply existed in the same space, breathing the same cedar-scented air, surrounded by the same evidence of lives that had refused to be diminished by the cruelty of others. Eventually, Dorothea rose. She placed the cardboard box of photographs on the workbench beside the cedar chest. Her hands lingered on the cardboard edge. "These belong with you." No dramatic reconciliation followed, no embrace, no tears shared between women who had spent months on opposite sides of a grief they should have carried together. Some fractures closed slowly, one small gesture at a time, one unanswered slight forgiven without discussion, one phone call made 6 months later that begins with weather rather than apology, because weather is safer. Weather doesn't require courage the way direct conversation does. But the door to the shed remained open behind Dorothea as she walked to her car. She didn't close it. Caroline noticed. Some doors once opened are meant to stay that way. Vera returned that evening. She carried no pie this time, no offerings. She arrived with empty hands, as though what she had come to deliver could only be carried in words. They sat in the shed. The rocking chair was empty. Neither woman chose it. Caroline sat on the floor beside the cedar chest. Vera settled onto the wooden bench near the workbench, her small frame silhouetted against the last light coming through the eastern window. Caroline asked the question she had been holding since Roy Callahan's visit, the question that had been circling her thoughts like a hawk above the orchard, patient, persistent, refusing to land until the right moment. Roy told me Amos didn't die alone. He said someone visited him every year after he left Vermont. Someone unexpected. She looked at Vera directly. You told me the same thing the first week I was here. You said I'd never guess who it was. Vera removed her glasses, cleaned them with the edge of her jacket sleeve, replaced them. The ritual took longer than necessary, a deliberate pause, the kind that precedes words that have been stored for decades. Amos left Vermont in the spring of 1995. He was 57 years old. Vera's voice was steady but thin, carrying the careful modulation of someone who has rehearsed a story so many times it has become almost liturgical. Gerald had died that January. Heart attack, middle of the night, no warning. One evening he was sitting in this very room reading Whitman by lamplight. The next morning Harriet woke up beside a man who was no longer breathing. She paused. Let the weight of that sentence settle. Amos couldn't stay after Gerald was gone. Not because Harriet asked him to leave. She begged him to stay. I know because I heard her. I was standing in my kitchen. My window was open. Their voices carried across the orchard. She told him the farm needed him. She told him she needed him. But Amos understood something Harriet didn't want to accept. Without Gerald, his presence would change meaning. People who had tolerated him for Gerald's sake would no longer feel the obligation. The whispers would get louder. Amos had spent 27 years building a life on this farm, but that life had been built on a foundation of two people. With Gerald gone, half the foundation had disappeared. Vera looked toward the photograph on the wall. Amos, Harriet, Gerald, three people standing in a triangle of mutual devotion. He rented a room in a small town across the state line, Littleton, New Hampshire. 40 miles from here, close enough to reach by car in less than an hour, far enough that no one from this town would stumble across him by accident. Caroline listened. Her pulse was steady but elevated, the controlled acceleration of someone approaching a truth they have been pursuing for weeks. Harriet visited him. Vera's voice dropped. Every year, starting in October 1995, the first autumn after Gerald's death, she drove to Littleton alone, told no one, not me, not the neighbors, not her own daughter, your mother. She simply disappeared for a weekend each October, returned Monday morning, never mentioned where she had been. How do you know? Because in 1997, I followed her. Vera met Caroline's eyes without flinching. I'm not proud of it, but I was worried. She had been disappearing every fall for 2 years. She was getting older. The roads between here, Littleton Mountain, passes ice in October. I was afraid she was ill, confused, so I followed her. The shed was completely still. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound was the faint tick of the old pocket watch resting on the workbench, a mechanism that had continued measuring time long after the man who wounded it had stopped needing hours. She drove to a boarding house on the edge of Littleton. A plain building, white paint, green shutters like this farmhouse actually. She parked in the lot, walked to a door on the second floor, knocked 3 times. The door opened. Amos was standing there. He looked older, thinner, but when he saw Harriet, his face did something I've never forgotten. Vera paused. Her own composure, maintained through decades of secret keeping, wavered for the first time. She pressed her lips together, steadied herself. He smiled the way children smile, without reservation, without calculating whether the smile would be returned. Pure relief. The smile of a person who has been holding their breath for a year, waiting for the one day when the one person who makes the silence bearable walks through the door. Caroline looked at the cedar chest, the journals, the letters, the brass cup, the reading glasses, the pocket watch, all the small belongings of a life lived modestly, quietly, on the margins of a world that had decided it had no room for Amos Hale. She visited him 3 years, Vera continued. 995, 97. Each time for one weekend, each time alone. Each time she returned to this farm on Monday morning carrying nothing except a weariness that seemed heavier than what a weekend drive should produce. Then 1998. Vera nodded slowly. January 1998. The phone call came on a Thursday. The boarding house owner had found Amos in his room. He had passed during the night. Peacefully, they said, though I've never fully trusted that word when applied to someone who died alone in a rented room 40 miles from the only family he ever knew. But he wasn't alone. Caroline's voice was quiet. Roy said someone was with him. Roy was wrong about the timing. Vera's correction was gentle. Amos died alone. But Harriet arrived within hours. She drove through a snowstorm January in the White Mountains, the kind of storm that closes schools, cancels church. She drove anyway. When she arrived, she sat beside him for 3 hours before allowing the funeral home to take him. Then she went to his room, packed every object he owned into boxes, loaded them into her car, drove back to Vermont. Vera gestured around the shed with one hand, a slow, encompassing motion that included every shelf, every photograph, every journal, every letter, every pressed flower tucked between pages. She brought it all here. Every item you see in this room, the lantern, the glasses, the watch, the compass, the journals, these were Amos's possessions. His entire life, packed into the back of a station wagon on a January night, carried through a blizzard by a 70-year-old woman who refused to let the last evidence of a good man disappear into the inventory of a New Hampshire boarding house. How do you know what happened in that room? Caroline's voice was steady but searching. You followed her once in 1997. But you're describing 1998, the snowstorm, the 3 hours she sat beside him, the packing. You weren't there. Vera was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice carried the particular tenderness of someone honoring a confidence that had been given to her freely, late at night, between two old women who had run out of reasons to keep secrets from each other. After Amos died, Harriet came to me. 3 days later, she knocked on my door at 10 o'clock at night, the only time in 40 years she had ever visited me after dark. She sat at my kitchen table, drank a cup of tea, told me everything. The boarding house, the snowstorm, the 3 hours, the drive home with his belongings in the back seat. She needed someone to know what she had done. Not for praise, not for absolution. She needed a witness, someone alive who could verify someday that the woman who saved this man's memory was also the woman who drove through a blizzard to sit beside him when nobody else came. Caroline's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She didn't loosen them. The pressure was the only thing keeping her anchored to the floor while the full architecture of Harriet's plan revealed itself not as a spontaneous act of generosity but as a decades-long project of protection, preservation, patience. She spent the next week in this shed, Vera continued. I brought her food because she wouldn't leave. She cleaned every object, organized the shelves, arranged the photographs, placed the journals, the letters, everything into the cedar chest Gerald had built for their anniversary in 1962, the same chest you opened 2 weeks ago. She locked it, placed the key on top. Then she sat in that rocking chair, the one where your mother-in-law sat this morning, wrote 2 sentences on a piece of cream-colored stationery, folded them into an envelope, sealed it, walked across the orchard to the farmhouse. She placed the letter in her desk drawer beside her will. Before you sell this land, Caroline whispered, open the old shed. Vera nodded. She waited 26 years for someone who deserved to read what was inside. She waited for someone who had lost enough to understand what Amos had lost, someone who had been turned away from their own home, the way he had been turned away from his. Vera's gaze held Caroline's without wavering. She waited for you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the densest silence Caroline had ever experienced, packed with decades of unspoken devotion, unrewarded. The staggering patience of a woman who had spent a quarter of a century preparing a room for a granddaughter she barely knew, trusting that when the time came, the right person would walk through the door. Harriet had not simply preserved Amos's story. She had engineered its resurrection. She had anticipated the legal threats, protected the land with an irrevocable trust. She had written instructions that could only be understood by someone who had experienced loss firsthand. She had chosen Vera as the guardian of the final truth, the only person who could verify that the woman who saved Amos's memory had also been the woman who drove through a blizzard to sit beside a man the world had forgotten, who had carried his entire life home in the back of a car. Vera stood, adjusted her quilted jacket, walked to the doorway, stopped. Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever knew, not because she defied anyone, not because she fought anyone, because she decided 56 years ago that one man's life was worth remembering even if the rest of the world disagreed. She held that decision every single day until she died. Vera looked back at Caroline. Now it's yours. Then she was gone. The shed door swung gently in the November wind, tapping against its frame in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Caroline sat alone in the shed for a very long time. Spring arrived the way it always arrives in Vermont, not all at once but in accumulations, each day adding something the previous day lacked. First the light changed, lingering longer in the evenings, carrying a warmth that was more promise than substance. Then the snow retreated from the south-facing slopes. Then the apple trees the last to respond, holding their bare branches through March, through April's mud season, through the final frost erupted into white blossoms within the span of a single week, transforming the orchard into a landscape painted by someone who had just discovered the color white. The shed had changed too. Not in structure, the shelves remained. The rocking chair sat beside the eastern window. The cedar chest held its careful contents, but in purpose. The notebook Caroline had placed on the workbench in November had filled by January. A second filled by March. A third was nearly complete by mid-April. People came from neighboring towns carrying old letters, military, wedding photographs, recipes transcribed in the handwriting of mothers who were no longer alive. A county newspaper ran an article with the headline, "Where Forgotten Stories Find a Home." The shed had become what Harriet's dinner table had always been, a place where the forgotten were welcome. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late May, Eli sat beneath the oldest apple tree in the orchard, the one with the widest trunk, the deepest root, the branches that spread outward like an umbrella, reading one of Harriet's journals. Not Amos's journal, not Gerald's letters. Harriet's own words, written in the years after Gerald's death, after Amos, after the shed had been sealed. Her observations on aging, on memory, on the particular loneliness of being the last person alive who remembers a specific evening, a specific conversation, a specific quality of light falling through a specific window at a specific hour. Eli read these entries with the focused attention of a child who doesn't fully understand what he's reading, but understands that it matters. He turned the pages carefully, as though the paper were made of something more delicate than wood pulp, which, it was. It was made of time, of patience, of a woman's refusal to let the people she loved become abstractions. Caroline stood on the farmhouse porch, wrapped in the quilt she had carried from the shed on her first morning, the blue cream, pale green quilt that had been waiting on the rocking chair for 26 years. She watched her son reading beneath the apple tree. The blossoms had begun to fall, drifting downward through the warm air like slow white confetti. Some of them landed on the pages of Harriet's journal. Eli didn't brush them away. He let them stay as though they belonged there, decorations from the very trees that had witnessed everything these pages described. Eli looked up. His face carried an expression Caroline had not seen on him before, not quite maturity, not quite wisdom, but the beginning of something that would eventually become both. The expression of a person who is starting to understand that the world is larger, more complicated, more beautiful than he had previously believed. His voice crossed the distance between the tree, the porch. "Mom, do you think Great-Grandma knew all this would happen?" Caroline looked toward the shed. The late afternoon light was pouring through its eastern window, the same window through which morning sunlight had greeted her on the day she first lifted the iron latch. The light caught the glass at an angle that turned it golden, as though the window itself were generating warmth rather than merely transmitting it. She thought about Harriet, a woman who had driven through a blizzard to sit beside a dying man, who had packed his belongings into her car, carried them through a snowstorm, arranged them on shelves with the precision of someone who believed that how you preserve a life matters as much as whether you preserve it, who had locked a chest, placed a key on it, written a note, filed it beside her will, waited 26 years for a granddaughter she trusted to open the right door at the right time. I don't think she knew exactly what would happen. Caroline's voice carried the steadiness of someone who has stopped guessing about the future because the present is finally enough. I just think she believed that if enough people chose kindness, it would keep growing. Eli nodded slowly. The gravity of the gesture belonged to someone much older, or perhaps to someone exactly his age, 9, sitting beneath an apple tree in Vermont, holding the journal of a great-grandmother he never met but whose handwriting he now recognized the way he recognized his own mother's voice. I think she was right. Caroline walked down the porch steps, crossed the grass green now, soft underfoot, alive in a way it hadn't been when she arrived in November. She sat beside Eli beneath the apple tree. He leaned against her shoulder, still holding Harriet's journal, still reading. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers closed around the iron key. She held it in her open palm one final time, its simple shape, its darkened shaft, its unremarkable appearance. A key that opened one lock on one chest in one shed on one farm in one corner of Vermont. Nothing more, everything. She placed it in Eli's hand, closed his small fingers around it. He looked at the key, then at his mother. He didn't ask what it was for. He didn't ask why she was giving it to him. At 9 years old, sitting beneath an apple tree his great-grandmother had planted, holding a journal his great-grandmother had written, wearing a jacket his father had bought him, sleeping in a house his family had built, He understood in the way children understand things that adults have to rediscover, that some gifts don't come with explanations, they come with trust. The apple blossoms continued falling, the light continued deepening. The shed stood at the edge of the orchard, its door open, its windows catching the last golden hour of a Vermont afternoon. Inside, the cedar chest held its remaining secrets, not all of them discovered, not all of them meant to be. The notebooks waited for more stories. The rocking chair waited for more visitors. The quilt waited on its back, patient as always, ready for whoever needed it next. Somewhere in the distance, a car turned onto the dirt road. Another visitor, another story. Another person carrying something they had kept hidden for too long, arriving at a weathered red building where a simple sign promised that forgotten lives were welcome. If this story has reminded you of someone who once opened a door for you, someone who chose kindness when silence would have been easier, who loved you without conditions you didn't know existed until they were removed, don't wait for another season to tell them. Call them. Write the letter, share the photograph. Say the name out loud. Because memories fade. Buildings weather. Even the strongest hands eventually release what they've been holding. But love, when it is freely given, has a way of outliving the people who gave it. It passes from hand to hand, never cooling, never diminishing, never asking to be explained. It only asks to be carried forward. Caroline thought her grandmother had left her 11 acres of land. In truth, she left her a reason to believe in people again. Perhaps that's the greatest inheritance any of us could ever hope to receive.